This is Kristen Fye discussing the implications of cognitive science for the teaching and learning of mathematics. In this chapter, my discussion will focus on first defining cognitive science and discussing why an analysis of the field of research could help answer essential questions to the study of mathematics. Once establishing the significance of cognitive science's role in our field of study, I will address three notable methods of recent research examined in the chapter. In doing so, I will discuss landmark studies, notable findings, implications, and my own thoughts. To conclude, I will present some summative final thoughts and reflect upon the role of cognitive science in the future of mathematics education research. Cognitive science is the study of our brain and how it works in regard to information. Some of the key processes concerning cognitive science is memory, retrieving and transferring knowledge, and thinking. Cognitive science in reference to education seeks to answer a basic question: how do humans learn? We can take this expansive question and from there narrow our attention to essential questions that exist in our field of study. How do students learn mathematics, and how can teachers support students' learning of mathematics? Curiosity about how psychology enlightened educational practices can be traced back to William James' Talk of Teachers on Psychology in 1899. And Edward Thorndike's The Principles of Teaching Based on Psychology in 1906. This continues to echo the rich history psychology played in history of math ed research. Fast forward to the 1980s, which is chapter dubbed the apex of cognitive science's impact on math ed because of its central role in research at the time. The resurgence of the interest in cognitive science focused on identifying a set of learning or instructional principles from the U.S. Department of Ed and the American Psychological Association, and outlets intended to reach a broader audience. Much of this interest is due to funding priorities by the Cognition and Student Learning Program, CASL. Many cognitive scientists dispute recommendations that show the greatest ability for improving student learning. But there are many shared criticisms about the current body of work and what needs of the mathematics education research field are. One critique that was discussed is the lack of authentic educational environments in the studies, which was the notable shift late in the evolution of our field. Another criticism was the body of work didn't focus on the field of mathematics. Lastly, cognitive science research has rarely been interested in the role of the educator in creating supports for student learners. All of these criticisms seem to call for a new cognitive science studies that value the nuances and needs specifically generated by math ed. Here are some notable methods of recent research. The three methods are explanatory questioning, worked examples, and metacognitive strategies. I'll discuss incorporating explanatory questioning first. Explanatory questioning is echoed in the push for a more student-centered classroom, where students not only recall information, but explain. This method also prompts students to interrogate what they already know with what they are learning. What intrigued me about the general goals of this particular method was the practice students would not only be able to explain their own thinking, but understand and critique their peers. There are two main origins for this research: elaborative interrogation and self-explanation. Elaborative interrogation refers to the asking of why questions, while self-explanation is the process to try and make sense of new information by explaining it to yourself. A short laboratory study looked at the effects of elaborative interrogation on fact learning. Students in grades 4 through 8 were given a declarative statement such as, "The woman opened the door." Some students were then given a piece of additional information to provide meaning for that fact. For instance, the woman opened the door to let her dog outside. While other students were asked to form their own significance by asking, "Why did the woman open the door outside?" In this experiment, students prompted with elaborative interrogation recalled the facts given to them better than students provided additional information. In a recent dissertation, community college students were asked to read a passage from a textbook. Some students were given the condition of elaborative interrogation by being provided 9 why questions to accompany the text, while others were simply asked to reread the text. And again, those students prompted with elaborative interrogation recalled the facts given to them better. Some of the implications of the work discussed shows high knowledge learners have an easier time accessing prior knowledge, and therefore benefit more from this questioning strategy. So in order to make this an effective strategy for low knowledge learners, the why questions may need to be skillfully written. I found this to be an obvious practice of differentiation. The other center of explanatory questioning is the process of self-explanation. Oftentimes, students are prompted to self-explain by being provided several specific questions. These questions reminded me of two things that hang on my wall in my classroom. The first is the 100 questions that promote mathematical discourse. These questions are not only repeated on the posters, but designed to have students explain their thinking. Engaging in this type of questioning also lends itself to ensuring students are employed in another poster in my room, the 8 mathematical practices from the Common Core curriculum. Let's look at some notable research. Chi and colleagues have been focused on self-explanation since at least 1989. In earlier work, they simply asked university students to think out loud while studying physics passages. And as late as 2014, Chi has shown that the benefits of self-explanation are that it provides students to identify gaps in understanding and pushes learners to consider if their knowledge is flawed and needs to be modified to fill the gaps. In 1983, D.C. Berry had an article in Quarterly Journal of Experimental Psychology where he worked with undergraduates who were asked to verbalize their thoughts as they worked through a logic puzzle. Those who engaged in self-explanation were more likely to complete the task correctly than those that didn't. Riddle Johnson in 2006 worked with upper elementary students in math equivalency problems. The result indicated that students engaged in self-explanation improved procedural and promoted transfer. It also found that the process of self-explaining improves learning even with little or no feedback of the quality or accuracy of those thoughts. Wang in 2002 worked with 9th grade geometry students on theorems. The students with self-explanation condition achieved greater gains on the post-assessment. Some of the implications of the work discussed that unlike elaborative interrogation, self-explanation can benefit high and low knowledge students. In order to make this an effective strategy, quality of questioning may need to be improved from training. I'm now going to discuss the idea of instructional use of worked examples. Worked examples generally include the problem statement and procedure for that statement. Sometimes they'll include partially completed solutions requiring completion or incorrect solutions requiring correction. Work examples favor novice learners, and research suggests delaying problem solving in favor of more comprehensive study of worked examples. This is based on cognitive load theory, which is concerned with the natural limits of our working memory. Sweller's cognitive load theory had me considering a question I had never asked myself before when designing instruction. How can I design instruction so that I avoid unnecessarily taxing students' limited working memory? When I read this section, I was immediately challenged by two other realms of belief. One is that I should be more consistently providing rigorous thought and discourse in my classroom, even for novice learners. And another immediate challenge in my thoughts was that it seemed to be inherently against low-floor, high-ceiling tasks. Looking at the research, in 2009, Schwanke did a laboratory study where he had geometry students work through 7 problems with a computer tutor. Some were presented as worked examples that were gradually provided less information where students were tasked with finishing the problem. Students who were part of the worked example condition showed greater gains in conceptual knowledge in less time. Van Loon-Hillen and company worked with 4th graders learning subtraction. Some of them had regular curriculum, while others were supplemented with worked examples. They found similar gains in both groups, but again, the second group found those gains in less time. Riddle Johnson and Wrinkle studies were not described, but their findings reported that evidence shows comparing and contrasting worked examples is more effective than looking at the same worked example, and that worked examples paired with self-explanation is especially valuable. The last method presented that I will discuss is training in metacognitive strategies. Metacognition is described as the awareness of the ability to monitor and adjust thinking. The work in math ed research is centered around how training students in this awareness can improve their problem-solving performance. Kramarski has been working on metacognition instruction in mathematics for more than 20 years. The work with Maravec in 1997 was based on an instructional method referred to as IMPROVE, where the M was part of an acronym standing for metacognition. Students were prompted to ask themselves questions when solving math problems based on comprehension, strategy, and connection. The work with improved strategy has shown success with K-12 and pre-service math teachers. In Kramarski's work with Zoldan in 2008, some 7th grade classes had metacognitive self-questioning regularly implemented and showed gains. In 2012, Fiorello worked with university students engaging in military simulators and computer programs. After the decision was made, students were asked metacognition questions to analyze decisions by asking themselves questions. 2009, Jakobski and Harkskamp developed a computer software that gave metacognitive hints to fifth graders learning to solve math word problems. Students who used the computer program for an hour a week outperformed those that didn't. What was most interesting was that students asked for more hints saw the most gain. The major implication of the research is with the ambiguity of what is most effective, a controlled model like improve, or just merely asking students to think about and explain what they are doing while problem solving. The research discussed has shown meaningful growth in student learning and cognitive science, has suggested these methods as powerful recommendations to be put into practice. Some of the reasons mentioned in discussion on the Compendium by researchers was the U.S. Department of Ed's Cognition and Student Learning Program to support their research. It has given over $1 million in the past 15 years. One of the most comical arguments was the practice is dirt cheap, or rather, it costs little or nothing to implement. Even though there are some clear improvements on student learning, educators still have some specific questions that need to be answered to find confidence in turning this research into practice. One of the early and often criticisms was the lack of attention and the nuances of math curriculum and classroom needs. Another critique is to define and explain individual differences to moderate the effectiveness of the suggested instruction practice. Finally, most of the studies presented are not done in the classroom setting. The current research cannot show unavoidable complexities of the classroom. The writers of this chapter plead that there be more interdisciplinary work between psychologists and mathematics education researchers to create a more robust work of research that results in a more informative education practice.